What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the site. Welcome back to a brand new video. Today we are going to be touching on cramping and how we can reduce the risk of cramping, avoid cramping, and we're going to do so primarily through looking at two electrolytes, calcium and sodium. Now, that's not to say that these are the only two factors that go into reducing the risk of cramping. Of course, that's not the case. But those are the two that we're going to look at. We'll touch a little bit on the likes of stretching and a couple other tips that I'll throw in at the end of the video. But for the bulk of this video, we are going to be looking at calcium and sort of what's going on within a muscle tissue that cramping is, and where is cramping present, and how can calcium aid in reducing that, and then also we'll touch on sodium as well and the role that sodium has in reducing cramping. So we're going to dig right in to calcium, and in order to gain a better understanding of how calcium actually affects the contractile process, we are going to have to run through sort of a little bit of an education, working our way down to the myofibril level, looking at a muscle tissue. So of course we have three types of muscle tissue. We have cardiac, which of course is at the heart, smooth, which is sort of the blood vessels, and these two are involuntary, so we don't have any control over the contractile process here. And then we have skeletal muscle, so the muscle in your bicep, in your chest, and your quadricep, and of course this is voluntary, which means we have control over that contractile process and over what that muscle is essentially going to do. Within, of course, we're going to look at skeletal muscle here. We don't really need to tap into these because with them being involuntary, we don't really have much control, as I say, over the manipulation of those. And so we can almost sort of put those fingers down, and we're going to look at skeletal muscle for today. So when we've got a skeletal muscle, this is broken down, of course, into muscle fibers, and then each individual muscle fiber is striated by what we call myofibrils. And so if you imagine a diagram, you've got in fact, I'll put one over the screen if I can, of sort of a long cylindrical diagram, if I can find one, where it shows your muscle tissue, your skeletal muscle tissue, and then one of the muscle fibers come out, and then within that a myofibril. And if we look a bit deeper into each individual myofibril, we can see that it's separated by these sort of blocks almost, and these are called sarcomeres. Now, within a sarcomere, there are two filaments. A thick filament known as a myosin filament and a thin filament known as an actin filament. Now, these are just two protein filaments that essentially are involved in the power stroke motion, and I'm going to touch a little bit into that motion right now just to make sure that you have a full understanding of the contractile process in order to see how calcium comes in and essentially saves the day. So I've just thrown a diagram on the screen which will show you essentially what a sarcomere looks like. And the red filament in the middle, the thick filament, this is known as myosin. And the little blue filament, the thin filament, which we know as actin, is present obviously in blue. So if you imagine that the red filament, the myosin, has almost an arm, I'll flip that to me so you can see, that reaches up and grabs hold of the actin and essentially pulls it along, almost like a rowing boat. If you imagine that it grabs, it pulls, it grabs, it pulls, and essentially this is called power stroke, and this is the contractile process known as sort of a muscle shortening or a muscle contracting. So when my bicep moves like that, you can see that the muscle will get shorter. That's because all of the sarcomeres, the myosins, have all pulled the actins in from both sides, and the muscle has shortened, and this is what creates a contraction. So you're probably thinking, well, why is this relevant to cramping? And this is where calcium comes in, and it will all start to make sense. So this myosin head that we've just spoke about hangs on to that actin and pulls it essentially to create a contraction of a muscle. But unfortunately, there is this bad protein known as tropomyosin, which almost sort of intervenes and blocks that motion from happening. And so the myosin reaches up to grab and pull that actin, but it is essentially blocked by a bad protein known as tropomyosin. Now, we can counteract that through a good protein and calcium. So the good protein is known as troponin, and of course calcium is known as calcium. And when we combine these two, it essentially displaces that tropomyosin and allows the contraction to take place. And so you can see now sort of if we aren't adequately controlling for hydration of calcium and calcium isn't present within this process here, that contractile process will simply be blocked because the tropomyosin has been able to block that myosin from pulling the actin, and this is what we know as a cramp. So there's a little bit of a background behind what a cramp actually is before we touch on how we can remedy them. So an example of this in action is if I go to do a bicep flex and shorten my bicep, as I'm coming, all of a sudden I've run out of calcium. Oh, I can't go any further because the contractile process has been blocked by a lack of calcium, and so I'm almost stuck in here, and then we can see a bunch of cramping going on here, which I'll dig into if necessary. If you're interested in learning more about the cramping process itself, drop me a message to the Instagram that's on the screen, but I'm going to leave it there in terms of education and touch a little bit more on what you wanted to know, which was how you can actually avoid cramping. So hopefully now you can really see the importance of calcium being present in that contractile process. In terms of a dosage of calcium, I think that 1200 milligrams is more than sufficient. That's the RDI, the recommended daily intake, and I think that is, as I say, more than sufficient. The upper limit is 2,500, so there really isn't too much of an issue pushing a little bit further than that, but I would want you to be sufficing with at least 1200 milligram if possible. Unfortunately, we are going to need to look to grab this from dairy sources. So things like your milk, cheese and yogurt. And the main reason behind me saying that is simply from a meta-analysis done a few years ago that concluded there is a vastly increased risk in the risks of CV disease from cardiovascular disease from supplemental calcium compared with that of sort of your dairy sources. There is more on that in the meat dehydration video, so I'll put a picture of the thumbnail on the screen. You can go and catch it either on the website or on my YouTube channel. And you will hopefully be able to learn a little bit more about that study itself. When we control for calcium, we of course have to control for vitamin D3 and vitamin K2 as well. Vitamin D3 is going to allow us to vastly increase the amount of the calcium that we can absorb. It will essentially just increase absorption of that calcium dramatically. And the vitamin K2 is there to basically shunt that newly increased absorbed amount of calcium to the right places. So it takes that calcium and it pushes it out of the blood vessels into the bones, the teeth, the contractile process that we just spoke about. And so from a utilization perspective, it's really important that we control for both vitamin D3 and vitamin K2. Vitamin D3 you can pick up from any sort of source. I like the bulk powders one. As that will need to be supplemented because it is primarily synthesized through the skin from sunlight exposure, so I would look at supplementing that. Vitamin K2, just grab your egg yolks. In terms of sodium, it is incredibly person and sport dependent in terms of the dosage. If you are someone who sweats a lot, you're going to need a lot more sodium than someone who doesn't, because our sweat is predominantly sodium. And so if you are someone who competes in long distance, you're a long distance athlete, or just generally someone who sweats a lot, you're going to need a lot more sodium than someone like myself who's a powerlifter who doesn't really sweat anyway. And so I'll keep hold of a lot more of the sodium that I've took on pre and intra compared with you, for example, if you are a long distance athlete who sweats a lot. In terms of the benefits from having sodium present as well, obviously it's going to vastly increase our blood volume, and so we can take more of that oxygen, our nutrients, our electrolytes to the working muscles and utilize those better. And so from a cramping perspective, which is what this video is touching on, an example would be the calcium that I spoke on earlier. If we have a decreased blood volume, we may be more susceptible to cramping due to the fact that we have less calcium actually being shunted to the muscle, and therefore we cannot displace the tropomyosin and cramping is present. And so it really, really is important that we control for sodium and calcium. Okay, so what can we do to actually reduce the risk of cramping? Firstly, adhere to what I've just touched on in terms of hydration of electrolytes. It's not only sodium and calcium that you must control for. They are the only two I've touched on in this video. Magnesium, potassium, these are all incredibly important in terms of reducing the risk of cramping. Secondly, a warm-up, ramp warm-up, for example. Raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate. If we can incorporate something like the ramp warm-up, which if you're unsure what that is, there is a full breakdown of exactly what that is, how to structure it, how to set it up and how to execute within my training ebook, which is on the screen now. Go and check it out if you are curious as to what that ramp warm-up is. And if we can obviously complete this, we are going to see increased blood flow, which is very, very similar to what I touched on in terms of sodium when it comes to blood volume increasing. And so there's more oxygen, nutrients within the muscle, therefore less likely to see any of the negative implications that come with not having them there. Remember as well, it's incredibly intensity, gender, hereditary dependent. You can inherit things like being more susceptible to cramping. Males are generally more susceptible to cramping, especially males who train at a greater intensity, because the higher your intensity, the more likely you are to see cramping present. Something else that is actually really interesting is a pickle for reducing cramping. Not only has it got a load of salt, but it also contains acetic acid, which essentially will stimulate a reflex where we can see an increase in inhibitory neurotransmitter activity, which is obviously going to vastly reduce the risk of cramping as well. Now, you guys know that I'm not huge on stretching. I think that if it makes you feel a bit better, then go for it. And if you're going to stretch, dynamic over static any day. But I couldn't not include stretching because the literature seems to support that it is the single best tool in terms of relieving fatigue-induced cramps. It's down to sort of being able to build tension within the GTOs, the Golgi tendon organs. And so I really couldn't not include it. But as I say, if you're going to stretch, really try and get as much dynamic stretching as you do static, because realistically the static stretch, it's a topic for its own video, but yeah, I couldn't not include that. And so overall, that's essentially my two-piece on cramping. As I say, I certainly haven't covered every topic as I do it in every video, because I could sit here and talk to you for an hour, but I think that the main two areas of me to focus on from this video or main focus generally is just electrolyte hydration. If you're curious on a little bit more information on electrolyte hydration, then I have a meet day hydration video. I'll put it on the screen again. Go and check that video out. There is a bunch of information on sodium, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and how you can apply that to a meet day, a powerlifting meet. As usual, any questions, drop me a message on Instagram, and I'll see you in the next video.